People who've gotten their bosses fired. How? The CEO publicly praised me for completing a task that my boss had struggled with, so my boss retaliated by forwarding all of his tasks to me in an effort to overwhelm me with work. I actually found his job pretty manageable, which the CEO also noticed and fired him, giving me his job in office. He grabbed the back of my neck and said, "If you ever say I'm wrong in front of a customer again, I will beat your ass." I went to the GM and told him, and my supervisor was relieved of his duties about 5 minutes later. Removed. It was my supervisor. It got to the point that I had decided to quit. I had my resignation letter in my purse, but decided to let his boss know why I was quitting. Supervisor would talk about all the people on our team constantly, but only behind their backs. I got so sick of telling him to cut it out. My husband and I happened to work at the same place, different departments, and my supervisor would make sexual comments about threesomes with him. Ew. What hotel we picked for our afternoon delight, shit like that. It was so bloody uncomfortable. Apart from this, he spent most of his supervising time outside smoking. Problem was, supervisor was one of the guys, and I was the only girl. Turns out his boss was disgusted, told his boss, who lost his mind. They started an investigation which took 3 days. They interviewed staff, they corroborated what I said. They checked the security cameras, saw he was spending most of his workday outside smoking. And was fired. When he was told, he guessed, wasn't hard. That I was the person who complained and tried to get to me to apologize that I took it the wrong way. The best feeling was my coworkers surrounding me as he was wailed out. That was a lovely ending to it all. My boss hired me at a surprisingly good salary, and got me 2 raises in the first 5 years. When the work slowed down to our department, he defended all his employees to management. They fired him the same day they fired me. Was working maintenance at an ice rink. The rule for anyone who knows how an ice rink works is if the Zamboni doors open, you get the fuck off the ice. Some dickhead decided to ignore the fact that they were open and that I was standing in the doorway, and decided to rip off one last slap shot. The puck bounced off the glass and hit me in the head. I was okay, but reported it to my boss, because we have to fill out an incident report for things like that. The boss asked, "Are you okay?" I said I feel okay. Then he responded with, "Well, we don't really have to report it then, do we?" I reminded him of the protocol, but it was clear he didn't want to do it. Since he wouldn't do it, I sent a descriptive email of the incident up to the administration, because I felt there should be some sort of documentation, paper trail, in case God forbid I ended up having a brain hemorrhage or something a few days later. The boss was fired by my next shift. I was fired because I abandoned my job, while on short-term disability, because while on approved leave, they are a date for me to return, never informed me, by their own admission, and when I obviously didn't return to work. I was fired. The locker I had at work had my work boots in it that the company pays $90 a year towards. However, there isn't a pair under $100 available. So you always end up having some come out of your paycheck. At that point, they are yours regardless of the company line. They disagreed and said they were thrown out. I reported them stolen, and the HR director responsible for getting me fired was fired. I took a cell phone video of her taking money from the safe and putting it in her wallet. I knew she was doing it, and I also knew that the moment it came out that money was missing, she'd blame it on me. She was so stupid that she didn't realize she should stop doing that while I was standing 10 feet away with my phone out and facing her. Phoned him to tell him I won't be at work for the rest of the week as my mom is terminally ill in hospital. The next day, about an hour after she passed away, he phoned and asked why I wasn't at work. I just hung up on him so I wouldn't say anything that would get me in trouble. The next day I sent the area manager a WhatsApp message explaining what he'd be done and attached a video of him breaking the freezer door while having a tantrum which cost the store nearly £5,000 and lost stock in the repair costs, which he'd told the AM it broke on its own. He got fired that day and I got 2 weeks off with full pay. About 15 years ago, I worked at a major university in the IT department. After I was hired, it took me a couple of months to realize my boss was a sociopath, as was his number 2 guy. Once I realized what I was dealing with, I just tried to keep my head down because I didn't want to job hop so soon after leaving my last job. But they made that impossible. We had a database administrator and I was interested in becoming a DBA, so I talked to him a lot about what I should do to transition from a programmer to a DBA. The VP of IT, my boss's boss, would stop by and talk to me and ask me about my aspirations, so I told her about wanting to be a DBA and that I was actually taking night classes so I could. This was a woman who my boss referred to as, "she who must be obeyed," in a totally disrespectful manner. As the months went on, I saw more and more egregious behavior by my boss and his number 2 toady. We had a large corporation consulting on transition to their database. This included a young guy who was doing the database install, including ordering the right equipment and migrating the data. We also had student workers in our department. They were students who worked part-time hours. One of these was a young woman. The big corp young guy and the young woman started going to lunch together. Apparently this was offensive to my boss, who threatened both of them with termination for fraternization. The university had no such rule, my boss was just making it up as he went. About 6 months after I was hired, the DBA quit. I went into our weekly staff meeting and at the end, my boss announces that I'd been promoted to DBA. My spidey senses were tingling because of his tone of voice and because this was the first I was hearing about it. After the meeting, I went to his office to thank him and tell him I really appreciated the chance. He was very angry. Apparently, his boss had made him promote me. I had no idea. The next thing I know, I'm being called into my boss's number 2 guy's office. He tells me that performance reviews were coming up and I would have to be reviewed on job description of DBA rather than the job description of my old position. That is, unless I turned down the DBA position. Yep, he was threatening me to get me to turn down the promotion. I asked him to see the written description of my old position as well as the one for DBA. He couldn't give them to me because they didn't exist. Now, I can be a pretty stubborn bitch, and this really pissed me off. I didn't do anything wrong and now my job was being threatened. Part of my job duties during the 6 months of my employment involved working with the head of every department of the university, including the legal department. I had a good working relationship with every head of every department. So I made an appointment with the university's head counsel. I explained the situation to him, including my boss's boss making him promote me and my boss threatening me with my performance review. I told him that, although I was studying to be a DBA, I was really not qualified to be one without some hard work, and if the university didn't want me to take the position, I would absolutely turn it down. I also mentioned my boss's nickname for his boss and the issue with the student worker and the big corp guy. Apparently, the student worker had already filed a harassment complaint, so the head counsel knew about it. He told me I had been promoted by someone, boss's boss, who had every right to promote me and I should not worry about anything. He said if my boss gave me any more trouble that I should let him know. A week later my boss and his number 2 toady were fired. My boss ended up working at a small city college and is there to this day. I pity his employees. I left the university about 2 years later and had a successful career as a DBA. About 13 to 14 years ago, I was working as a web designer for a .com. In our immediate group were a creative director, a creative manager, and 2 of us who were designers, and we were all part of the marketing department. The creative director was a joke. Brought in by the previous VP of marketing who he was friends with, he hardly did any work himself, and just played online poker waiting on us to send him things for approval. And he'd never stick around late when the rest of us needed to stay late to hit a deadline or deal with a crisis, etc. The creative manager, who'd been in charge for a couple years before the creative director's hiring, still ran the day-to-day. So the creative manager gave his notice that he'd accepted a new job, and when I met with the current VP of marketing to discuss transition, I mentioned that the creative director would need to step up and pull his weight. I guess a similar message was expressed by a number of people, and less than a week after the creative manager's last day the creative director was fired. This kind of sucked because we went down from 4 to 2 people in our group. I was appointed acting creative manager, and we eventually did hire one more designer. I left the company a couple months later, too, after the latest VP of marketing was let go and there was going to be a 10th different person overseeing marketing in my 5 years there. And the asshole creative director? He'd reached out at some point, looking for files for his portfolio, I think? And it happened to be in the 2-week window where I'd accepted my next job but hadn't yet started, so I mentioned my new position. Well, he fires off a copy of his resume to the company president and tried to poach my new job out from under me. On my first day at the new job, the president mentioned that somebody else from that same company also applied for the job and forwarded me the application email to see if I knew him. Saw that the date was after he and I had last communicated. Not my boss, but I helped my friend get her boss fired. He was a general manager, and always grabbing her sides, purposely scheduling her to have shifts alone with him, asking her for nudes, asking her to sleep with him, etc. She reported it so many times to the owner, Big Boss, and they said they couldn't do anything because they hadn't seen it and had no their reports other than her account. So I called and complained as a customer about how I witnessed him being creepy to her and how it made me uncomfortable. For the most part true lol, I just don't shop there. My manager wanted to prove I'm slacking off so he could write me up. So he watched CCTV footages, then wrote, printed out and signed a detailed 17 pages worth of Word document what did I do in the past 2 days. With timestamps, like, 7:59 arriving, 8:01 speaking with coworker A and B, 8:07 sitting down to my desk, etc. He told me that he's not happy with my work ethics if I won't improve my efficiency. I'm forward. I took the papers and showed to his boss and told her that I'm not happy with my manager's work ethics and his efficiency might be better if he wouldn't watch 17 hours of CCTV footages to spy on an employee. She was terrified. It would have been a rock-solid lawsuit for me, but I love my job, and we had to search for a new manager. Also, my salary raised. I took a phone call on my cell when at my desk. Middle manager came up and screamed at me, yelling about how I was not allowed to take calls for clients while at that office. I was a contractor and made it perfectly clear that I did work for multiple clients prior to doing work for this company. The CTO's office was 10 feet from mine. He came out and stood in his doorway listening to the rant. When the middle manager was done, I just looked over at the CTO and said, "It's him or me, and at the moment I don't give a fuck which you pick." CTO walked the middle manager out right then. Funny thing, I didn't hang up throughout the incident. And it was my wife on the other end. I was spending about 70 hours a week at their site digging their staff out of a hole they had dug themselves in.